Tonight on KQED Newsroom, with the election just 4 days away, President Trump and Joe Biden make their closing pitches. But with a record number of people voting by mail, the winner may not be known for some time. And we take a look back at the history of election polling, including President Trump's surprising upset in 2016 with the author of the new book, Lost in a Gallup. Plus, in our hyper-partisan world, can people with different political views spark a romantic connection? We hear from the hosts of a dating podcast on their relationship experiment. Also, pumpkins galore. We'll revel in a time-honored autumn tradition. Welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. And now for KQED Newsroom's Election 2020 coverage. We're finally here in the last few days before Tuesday, November 3rd, Election Day. Voters have submitted early ballots in record numbers, with roughly 80 million votes already cast. In the nearly 4 years since President Trump took office, regulations have been rolled back, immigration has been curtailed, and the American judicial system has become significantly more conservative. This week, Amy Coney Barrett was sworn in as the newest Supreme Court justice in a Monday night ceremony on the White House lawn. But according to polls, her confirmation has not yet proven to be a game changer for President Trump. Democratic rival Joe Biden is leading in several critical states and has raised more money. Joining me now by Skype from San Francisco are KQED Politics and Government Senior Editor Scott Shafer and KQED Politics and Government Correspondent Marisa Lagos. Thank you both for joining us.
Good to be with you.
Scott, we've just recorded our worst week of COVID cases in the nation, although California has so far avoided a spike. We expected the pandemic was going to increase early mail-in voting, but the numbers are far above what was expected. Who benefits from this electoral surge?
Well, the conventional wisdom, Priya, is that whenever there's a larger than expected turnout, Democrats tend to benefit more than Republicans, because Republicans historically are very reliable voters, whereas you have a lot of occasional voters among Democrats, first-time voters, younger voters, more low-income voters. Those are all folks who sometimes vote and sometimes they don't for various reasons. So you would guess that in a lot of places, this bigger turnout is going to help Joe Biden and any other Democrats that are on the ticket. But, I think we all have to be careful in making too many assumptions about things. We do have to wait for the ballots to be counted. We expect a lot of Republicans to show up on Election Day to vote in person, partly because of what President Trump has been saying, that voting by mail is not safe, it's rigged, which it isn't, of course, but it has had an impact on Republicans.
So, Marisa, let's talk about that waiting. Do you expect Election Day to turn into Election Week or longer?
Well, it's going to depend, obviously, on where you are. In California, that's been the case for a decade. It's very unusual that any really contested races here are settled on election night. I would expect that, presidential race-wise, it's really going to depend on what we're seeing as those early returns are finally counted. And some of those, some of the states we'll be watching, like Florida, do allow processing of ballots before 8 p.m. on Election Day. But I think the big question here in California is going to be some of those tighter measures, ballot measure races, where polling shows that they're really neck and neck, and we're not going to be able to make a call until we have all the votes counted.
Scott, Berkeley and IGS just put out a recent poll of Californians. 87% of respondents said, quote, they worry that many Americans will not respect the outcome of this year's presidential election. And a similar number, nearly 9 out of 10 people, think violence is likely to occur if there are disputes about who won the election. Yikes. Would you expect this sort of civil action to center in Washington, D.C., or would it be more widespread?
It's hard to say. I think that these are very genuine and legitimate concerns. We have heard a lot of comments from the president calling into question whether or not he would actually accept the results of the election if he loses. I think, there was an analysis done by an international organization that looks at trouble spots around the world, and the states that they focused in on were places like Oregon, where there's a big militia movement, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, a little bit in California as well, but I don't think it would necessarily be focused on D.C. I think I would look more at some of these states that are, especially if they turn out on election night, to be really close, and then, of course, to see what the president does and says. If he declares victory before all the votes are counted, I think you're going to see potentially both sides out on the streets. And, it's also concerning. We've seen a big uptick in the number of guns purchased. The country is extremely polarized. There's a lot of anxiety. So I think there's good reason to be concerned, be anxious. Let's just hope, all of it, none of it plays out.
And of course, there's concern also about whether or not President Trump would vacate the White House. Marisa, let's turn to Kamala Harris, our senator here in California. Joe Biden had a very big fundraising day when he announced that she would be his running mate. What has been her net impact on the presidential ticket?
Well, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, Priya. $26 million in the first 24 hours after that announcement. The Biden campaign also took in more than twice what it had in August after her announcement. Twice in August what it had in July after that announcement. We've seen her sorority sisters from Alpha Kappa Alpha, which started at Howard University, put in 22,000 individual donations alone. So I think this has excited the base that Biden was really hoping, women of color in particular. We saw after the debate, for example, a huge fundraising haul for Democrats, the vice presidential debate. So I think that this has worked. I've talked to folks close to her. I think that Democrats still have some problems with men of color, Latinos and Black men in particular. They're going to have some work to do after this election, even if they win. But I do think Kamala Harris has served to kind of shore up part of the base and certainly the fundraising numbers that Biden was hoping she would.
Scott, what will it mean for California if Senator Harris becomes the new vice president?
Well, it'd be extraordinary, not just for California, but for the whole country. I mean, certainly with Nancy Pelosi as Speaker and Kamala Harris as Vice President, we would have a pipeline to the White House and to Washington. But I think, in general, really for the country and perhaps for the world, seeing someone like Kamala Harris, a woman of color, of mixed race descent, becoming vice president, she is a very different kind of person than we've seen in that job ever before. I was thinking about this earlier today, and she's really more of almost like a Justin Trudeau, someone who's younger, more youthful, more hip, a little bit less formal. That glass ceiling has never been broken, but it would mean a lot for California and, of course, for the country if she were to become vice president. It would be extraordinary.
Marisa, let's turn to the region. You've been talking to Californians who are helping Democrats work to flip Arizona blue. What are you hearing from them?
A lot of excitement, first of all. I've talked to a number of people who have either done phone or text banking from California, or even some folks who have gone out there in full PPE to do door knocking. I think that they see this state as a real potential. I mean, Mark Kelly is up. That is the Democrat running against Martha McSally in the Senate race there. We see Biden, really making some inroads, and it's certainly going to come down to, I think, a tight race there. But I think Californians really felt this year, Democrats at least, that, they didn't want to be on the sidelines like they felt they might have been in 2016, just waiting for results. And I think that they say that, in recent weeks, the conversations have shifted from will you vote for Biden and Harris to making sure those ballots are in. I think a lot of people in these swing states, quite frankly, are fatigued and tired of the calls and text and are just saying at this point, yeah, I voted, leave me alone, which, of course, is a win for these volunteers.
Scott, let's move to the Supreme Court. It's already weighed in on one aspect of the election. They sided with the Trump administration in a Wisconsin case, preventing ballots from being counted after the election day, even if they were postmarked from before the election day. They've also taken some other actions. What are you watching?
Well, I think so far the Supreme Court has mostly deferred to the states. They have not overturned. They more confirmed what the state courts have tried to do. I think, one of the most concerning aspects of all these rulings happened in Wisconsin, where they the court decided to uphold Wisconsin's rule that ballots that come in after the election would not be counted even if they're postmarked by election day. And Brett Kavanaugh, in his separate decision in that case, suggested along the lines of what President Trump has been saying, which is that ballots that come in after election day could, the word he used, flip the results, which is exactly what President Trump has been saying, to undermine the integrity and the confidence in the voting. And so that really got the antennas up of a lot of civil rights and voting rights folks, Democrats. And there was another case in Vermont where he alluded to Vermont, where he incorrectly wrote what was happening in Vermont, and the state asked him to change his decision. He went back and amended it. So I think everyone is on hyper alert. And I think the big question is what happens after the election? Do some of these cases come back to a court with Amy Coney Barrett, who so far has not weighed in on any of these cases?
All right, well, we've been talking a lot about the presidency, but the Democrats are fighting to also win back the Senate. They need to win 3 extra seats if Biden-Harris takes the White House and 4 extra seats if Trump-Pence are reelected. What are their chances of flipping the Senate? Marisa?
Well, Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, Republican, says they're 50-50. I think we've heard him increasingly kind of warn Republicans that this could go Democrats' way. Don't want to say anything as for sure until the votes are counted. But there are 9 Republican seats that either lean Democratic or are considered toss-ups under the Cook Political Report, which is a pretty well-known nonpartisan analysis group. Only 1 Democrat. And I mentioned, Arizona, Mark Kelly is doing super well. We have, Colorado, where it looks good for Democrats, a number of other states, even places like Georgia that a couple years ago we wouldn't have been talking about. So I think it's looking good for Dems, but obviously we won't know until all the votes are counted. And as Scott mentioned, that does not have to happen on election night.
So in state news, the Secretary of State's office just released its final pre-election update on voter registration. And it says that there is a record number of Californians, 22 million, who have registered to vote. That's 2 million more than in 2016. Let's turn to a statewide ballot measure, Prop 21. This would give cities more power to enact rent control protections. How is that doing among likely California voters?
It's not doing very well, and a very similar measure, Prop 10, was on the ballot just a couple of years ago, and it was overwhelmingly rejected by voters. I think this time around, some voters remember that earlier ballot measure and are wondering, why is this back on the ballot? We haven't changed our minds. Governor Newsom signed legislation expanding some protections for renters. So perhaps voters want to wait and see how those steps to address the problem. But it is not doing well. It's under 40%, and that's not a good sign this close to the election. So it has a real steep climb to make.
All right, Scott Shafer and Marisa Lagos leading our excellent politics team. Thank you so much, and good luck over the next few days and weeks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Priya.
Visit kqed.org/voter guide for a comprehensive look at all the state and local ballot measures, including summaries and arguments for and against them. At this time in 2016, just days before the presidential election, Hillary Clinton seemed like she had the win on lock. Poll after poll predicted her easy victory, but that was not to be. So how could the pollsters be so wrong? And since they were wrong in 2016, could they be wrong again in predicting Joe Biden's victory this year? Tonight, we delve into the history and limitations of polling in America. Joining us now by Skype from Kensington, Maryland, is W. Joseph Campbell, the author of Lost in a Gallup and a professor at the American University School of Communication. Joe, thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Priya. It's a real pleasure to be on your show.
You were a journalist before you became an academic. Talk us through how you saw polling before you started on your research for this book and how those views have changed.
I thought polling was pretty reliable. I just sort of gave polling the benefit of the doubt that these numbers, this precision that's inherent in numbers, was going to be accurate. And I didn't often give it really second thoughts. But as I got into the research for Lost in a Gallup, the more it became clear that polling is an imperfect instrument, susceptible to failure and susceptible to errors of differing kinds.
And you were spurred to write this book because of the 2016 election. I mean, we can't help but look back at that and recall how very wrong it went. This year, the polls in general have Joe Biden ahead of Donald Trump. Should we believe them?
We should keep in mind that polling does have a checkered past, and it's important to recognize that polls can go wrong. And when they go wrong, they can go wrong in surprising ways, in unpredicted ways that haven't happened before. So not all polling failures are quite alike, just like no 2 presidential elections are quite the same either. We've seen the 2016 model. We also have seen the 1948 model when the polls across the board were completely and uniformly wrong about the Dewey defeats Truman election, when Harry Truman won a surprise and dramatic upset election. So we see all these different varieties of polling failure, and I think that we're going to, if the next time the polls fail, they may fail in a surprising way, a way that we didn't expect, in a way that doesn't really mirror any previous polling failure.
Well, let's talk about why some of this is. What are the challenges that pollsters face when they are trying to get answers and put their finger on the pulse of Americans?
One of the biggest challenges in getting a decent response rate, and it used to be the gold standard of polling used to be that they would use landline telephones, random digit dialing, so they could reach listed as well as unlisted phone numbers. And because most people in the country, and I'm thinking the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, had telephones, that was a pretty reliable method of getting a representative cross-section of the country. And with the demise of, or the decline of landlines, we're seeing fewer and fewer people with landlines and fewer people answering the phone because they don't want to be harassed by telemarketers or other scammers or whatever. So the response rates in polling by phone, the former gold standard, have dropped off dramatically into the single digits, 5, 6, 7%. So to get a decent sample that way is very difficult, very time consuming, and obviously very expensive. So that is a major principal challenge that pollsters are facing these days.
Well, we do have the internet now. Has that gotten any better?
The internet is a tempting option for pollsters, but they still haven't figured out the way to get a real good representative sample using internet-based methodologies. And pollsters have been trying since the late 1990s, since the early days of the popular internet, to really tap that platform and to figure out a way to get a reasonably reliable sample. And so far, it hasn't really happened. Some polling organizations have recruited via the internet panels of respondents, people who they go back to time and time again for responses. And that is a very promising methodology, but it's somewhat expensive, and not everybody has adopted it. So the polling industry is one that's in a state of flux right now, Priya, and there's a lot of experimentation going on with a lot of different methodologies. There is no single gold standard anymore.
Well, you know, a lot of our work as journalists is based on what we see as in the polls, where we see who's up and who's down, and viewers and voters, they depend on that information. Are you telling us that really we shouldn't?
We should not rule out polls as automatically in error and just disregard them completely. But I think we should keep in mind that polling does have a checkered past, and to realize that these are imperfect instruments. They're useful tools, but they're not the only tool. But you're quite right. Journalists in particular do rely heavily on polls to set the conventional or the dominant narrative of election campaigns. And polls are the centerpiece of that narrative creation, if you will. And when polls go wrong, inevitably, journalism stumbles a bit too. There's this relationship. Polling failure equates to journalistic failure. And we saw that in 2016 when journalists thought the polls must be right. Donald Trump had no chance of winning the election. And we all recall the shock on the day after the election when Trump had won.
All right, well, give us your prognostication, reading the tea leaves. Who do you think is going to win this election from looking at the polls?
Are you really going to do that to me?
I'm doing it.
I wrote a book about polling failure, so I think I know best not to make any predictions. But let me tell you this, Priya. The likelihood that the polls are way off, uniformly off, and that Joe Biden is going to lose the popular vote in 2020, that is very unlikely. That is very unlikely. Now, how the Electoral College is going to break that, even though we're a few days from the election, that is still up in the air.
All right. W. Joseph Campbell, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight, the author of Lost in a Gallup.
Priya, thank you very much. A pleasure.
A new national poll by the Associated Press shows that 85% of registered voters describe Americans as being greatly divided in their values. As political partisanship has grown, studies also show the number of intermarriages between people in different political parties is shrinking significantly. Our next guests ran an experiment on their dating podcast to get an inside look at this relationship phenomenon. Joining me now by Skype from San Francisco are the co-hosts of the Dateable podcast, Yue Xu and Julie Krafchick. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us. Yue, tell us about this mini dating experiment and why you decided to run it.
Well, Priya, it gets pretty juicy because we talk about deal breakers so much on our podcast. And a lot of people this year said a deal breaker for me is dating someone of opposing political beliefs. So we thought, well, that's a very strong statement. Let's put that to the test. Let's set out a blind dating experiment with two people who do have opposing political beliefs and see if romance can develop from that. So we reached out to Facebook groups, our own community, our own network, as well as, we went out there on social media to see who would be brave enough to partake.
And you did eventually find two daters, Kiki and Tom. Julie, tell us who they are, something about their backgrounds, and why you selected them.
Yeah, first and foremost, they were both single. They are in their 30s in New York City, and Kiki is more liberal, voting for Biden, where Tom is a registered Republican and either voting for Trump or Jorgensen. And the reason why we picked them was they were, first of all, well-versed in politics, so they could have a very educated, open conversation. They also found this experiment to be intriguing, so they really came in with a very open mind. They also had a lot in common outside of politics. Like, they both were in the arts, they both had similar values of what they were looking for in a partner, and similar lifestyles.
And Yue, did you find, as you were sifting through the different applications of people who came in, that there were any differences between Republicans and Democrats in their interest in dating across the aisle?
The Democrats were very triggered. We got more messages from Democrats who said, I would never partake in this. This is very triggering for me. I don't think I could go through with this experiment. But the Republican applicants were a lot more open. And they said, I've been wanting to have an open communication and conversation with someone from the Democratic Party. So they were much more open to it.
Julie, was that surprising to the two of you?
It was. And I think what I learned too is that people just make rash generalizations about the party, where in today's world, it may not even be Democrat versus Republican. It is whatever values that they have.
All right. Yue, how did bringing up politics change the dynamic of the date for Kiki and Tom?
The first half of the date, we told them no politics, so they can talk about anything but. But the second half of the date, as soon as politics were on the table, you felt the tension. And that was the word that both of them used in their post-date interview. They felt that uncomfortable tension come in, because this is when it got real. This is when it got personal. But what was beautiful about this experiment was that by the end, they were able to find some sort of common ground and to openly hear each other out. So it wasn't a conflict or it wasn't a debate. It was more about, let's find where we can find common ground.
All right, so I want to listen to a clip from the Zoom date that you set up for them. And this is one in which they talk about President Trump, and Kiki begins it. So let's listen in.
I think about, his rhetoric has been so aggressive. Like, to me, it just and his I don't think he's been running things very well with the pandemic. All of these things to me feel like almost like personal. You know what I mean? How do you feel about that opinion when you hear someone who feels like what he's doing is very personal and hurtful? Do you align with that? Do you have sympathy for that, compassion for that? And then how does that inform how you decide to move forward?
Yeah, I think I could start with the denouncing racism thing. He certainly could have, and I would argue should have, made a stronger statement than he did, like at that moment in the debate. But he speaks off the cuff, and his off-the-cuff remarks don't always come over very well even. I think my other kind of, counter to that is I think his bark is worse than his bite.
So Julie, how did this conversation continue to play out? Did it foster understanding, or did it create more division between the two?
I think both daters walked away saying it was a good conversation. There wasn't a huge debate. There was that tension, as Yue mentioned. I think what we learned, though, was that everything else needs to be 100%, because this is still a big hurdle to overcome. And I think where Kiki was coming from is that she felt like a lot of this was personal and Tom couldn't fully understand.
Yue, for you, what were some of the takeaways from this experiment?
One big takeaway is, what if we approach politics like dating? These two people came on this date. You don't go on a date hoping the other person fails. You hope that they're a good match. So they came on the date trying to find common ground and trying to understand each other. We sometimes approach politics like a debate. We want the other party to fail, and we want to hear why they're so wrong and why we're so right. But in this experiment, you could see that they came in with such a positive, open mind that they were able to have more productive conversations.
Julie, do you feel the pandemic has shifted how people talk about politics? It seems like they're bringing it up earlier.
Absolutely. I think people are looking to get deeper quicker, because we're not dating multiple people at once, and we are potentially entering these more turbo relationships that move faster. So you want to know someone is aligned with you from a values perspective. I think, though, inevitably, this election is just so huge that it can't not come up on a date right now.
Yue, if you were to run this experiment again, is there something you'd do differently the next time around?
I think a couple things. I think we didn't have time on our side. If we had more time, I would have loved to space this out into 3-4 separate dates. So after each date, they have some time to just digest what was said and then come back nice and fresh. I think another thing is, what we really learned from this experiment is that we just have to go out and vote. So I wish there was more conversation that we would have brought in or prompted about voting, because it just shows you that politics is so personal, that Kiki felt like, I'm voting with my heart, I'm voting with my, what I've experienced, and Tom is very much about policy. So he's voting with what would benefit me from a political policy standpoint.
Julie, if you were to pull back a little bit and look at the scene broadly, how would you say that the hyperpartisanship of our electorate is being reflected in the dating pool, and what are the issues there?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are making blanket generalizations and potentially ruling out half the dating pool. And I think what I've learned from this is that it's not so black and white. It's not that all Republicans are X and all Democrats are Y. And I think people should look more at the individual. Of course, if their values do not align with you, that's one thing. But I'm going to look at it less about you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, and more about what you stand for individually.
Julie Krafchick and Yue Xu, thank you both so much, ladies.
Thanks, Priya.
Thank you.
You can hear more about Yue and Julie's dating experiment at dateablepodcast.com. And now for a look at something beautiful. This week, we step into a pumpkin patch or two to enjoy the rich colors and traditions of the season.
Place your pumpkins down in front of you. No, God, go like a captain.
Don't forget to turn your clock back this Sunday, November 1st, as we end Daylight Saving Time. You can find more of our news coverage at kqed.org/kqed-newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. You can reach me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Priya D. Clemens. From all of us here at KQED Newsroom, thanks for joining us. Good night.